Hello, my name is Amanda Suckow. Before preparing for this presentation, my experience with jazz was limited to an appreciation course I took in undergraduate school, a few lessons that I took on improvisation this summer, combined with my enthusiasm for the art. When selecting the topic of bebop in the string classroom, I envisioned an authentic resource with words and music spoken and played by people living the music. I didn't know what it would look like, but I trusted the process. It may surprise you to know that this resource was not scripted. When you experience the common themes that each of these musicians speak of, the synchronicity is undeniable. Each of these musicians is available to teach, and I highly recommend approaching your teaching with the curious mind of a student. Thank you, Renata, Curtis, and James, for your time and energy. The following video is intended as a resource to introduce teachers to bebop and other jazz styles. If the viewer has more questions following the presentation, I shall consider my work successful as the organizer of this resource. Every possibility in jazz opens a new range of options. Consider this my invitation to you to join me in the rabbit hole.
Bebop is like one part of an improvisatory language. When you play certain types of rhythms and certain types of melodic figures, it sounds like bebop. Then to someone who knows bebop makes them feel like they understand what you're trying to say.
I think it's very important that you give a variety of styles to every kid on any instrument. You cannot know what kind of music is going to resonate with a kid unless you've presented it to them.
To facilitate the bebop style, there needs to be a certain level of fluency on the instrument.
There's a lot of like little extensions and like a lot of like motion like that, which might be tough for somebody who's just getting the basics of hand frame.
Some of these heads can be pretty tricky to navigate. You need to have someone that could be in an equivalent book, late book 3, book 4.
So that would be like if you were at Suzuki book 4.
A lot of the stuff is like, go for it. That's the vibe. You have these fertile ears and you're hearing, and then you just go, you leap. So it was literally a language. If people were on the bandstand and they saw a certain type of person walk in, whether it was a person they thought should be there, that they want to get to know, or, or shouldn't be there in the club, they would play a thing, and that would indicate to the other players on the bandstand, to look at. So it was literally a language. It's also understanding the culture of that time. But for those musicians of color and musicians of color in general, especially since those guys were virtuosos, and they couldn't get on a concert stage. The only places they could play were in the clubs. Miles Davis was going to Juilliard, and then he was searching for Bird. He started playing with him to get into the thing, and then he quit Juilliard and just stayed there. And then that turned into his career.
Any time that I start with a class, I will talk about where our music came from. It is not unnatural to have string music in an African American style. Because of horrific racism, we did not allow African Americans to come into classical music traditions. Many of our seminal jazz players did start out as cellists or violinists, and they couldn't play those instruments and make a living. Coleman Hawkins was a cellist. He became a saxophone player. Nobody would accept him as a cellist. Milt Hinton, the bass player, was a violinist for silent movies, but he couldn't make a living with that once talkies started. So he started playing the bass. Ron Carter, the very famous bass player, started out as a cellist. Charles Mingus played cello from the age of 9, and he was very good. He couldn't get work, so he started to play a bass.
Miles Davis was at a club, and he was headlining, and he was out talking to a girl, and the police came and said, hey, what are you doing? He says, I'm headlining, and they thought he was being a wise guy, and they took him to jail, Back in those days, in the 40s, if you had any kind of dance band, you had to pay a separate tax. They could get guys that were incredible players that could play in such a way music that wasn't meant to be dance, but just knock people out with their performance. They could get by with just having a quartet or a quintet, would not have to pay the extra cabaret tax for the dance band, and wouldn't have to hire a big band. And people would come and they would just sit quietly and drink. They felt satisfied, that they got something for their money. Mm-hmm. And it worked out for club owners. It was really just a black, proud art form, and it was an unapologetic art form.
How do you get from chord to chord?
But aside from the theory of the bebop itself, which, as you point out, you could get pretty sophisticated, that instead of it being a 7-note scale, it became like an 8-note scale with an additional half step. If we're talking just a C major scale, so that's just your basic scale. But with the bebop,
I believe that you should know how to play chords on your instrument, even if you play the cello.
By thinking harmonically, you're thinking in terms of like shapes. There are many scales and there are many chords. One scale can fit over many different chords. And in fact, chords emerge from scales. Right? A B-flat major scale. If you just skip every note, you get that B-flat chord, which you could then play a B-flat major scale over.
I'll have them frame the chord, so I'll go. So just have them frame a dominant 7 chord. So that way they get the chord in their fingers, and then they get the descending scale. If you do it around the circle of fifths, you may have to move in positions a little bit. If you could get them to do it in 1 or 2 keys, hey, that's pretty good too, Once they learn that, they can start to learn these little licks. It has that third position like there. That one's not too bad. Ornithology is another one that's not too difficult.
But now I want to go to F7 land. And I'm not going to go back to C7 land. So how do you get from each room to the next? That's what you're always wanting to think about, I think. I want to teach people how to have jazz accented voices. So the way to do that at first is to teach jazz phrasing. It's not just teaching arpeggios, which you do have to know. And it's not just teaching blues scales, which you do have to know. But it's also what sounds like jazz. I think that learning how to play tiny phrases, a bunch of different keys, is one way to go, and that's what my book is. This is the first question. This is the answer to that. The answer is the same as the question. And then the next question is this. That's the answer. I could say, okay, I've got a question in D. And then the answer is the same. Right, now, I have this scale I could do with it.
You're associating chords with scales. You're not just thinking about them. Right, and so you're really getting it into your hand, and by repeating it so much, it gets into your ear. If you just think about those notes, if I take them out of order, if there's an E flat major chord, you might play that on the piano. It fits in that scale. And potentially you can alter one note instead of if we're hitting that E flat major, that's the third. I would suggest doing that with all the parts of the chord, or the note that you resolve to has a feeling to it, and that you can go out and then resolve to it, and then you understand which ones work best.
A lot of the bow strokes that work for jazz are also bow strokes that work for fiddle music.
Particularly in Celtic music, there's just a ton of swing. Doom, ba-oom, ba-oom, ba-oom. It's a softer sound. You're incorporating that idea into your playing. And those beats, ba, ba, ba-doo, ba-doo, ba, ba-doo, ba, those come to us directly.